There is an old truth that sounds beautiful until it begins to hollow a person out. The gentlest hearts often learn to survive by becoming lighter than their real weight. At first, it looks admirable: softness, patience, grace, the kind of person who never asks for too much, the kind who understands before being understood, the kind who apologizes for needing, thanks people for the bare minimum, and makes tenderness look effortless. People praise this kind of person. They say, how sweet, how mature, how low maintenance, how easy to be around. But there is a sadness hidden inside that ease. Because some people are not easy to love because life made them peaceful. Some are easy to love because they have spent years sanding down every sharp edge of their humanity until nothing in them feels difficult to hold. They become careful with their needs, careful with their anger, careful with their sadness, careful with how long they speak, how much they ask, how much room they take, how deeply they reveal, how honestly they react when something hurts. And if this has ever been true for you, then perhaps you already know the quiet fatigue of it. The strange exhaustion that comes from being loved most easily when you are least fully yourself. Because there is a difference between being deeply loved and being easy to keep around. One nourishes, the other trains you to disappear beautifully. That is where the deeper story begins. Why do some people spend their lives trying to be undemanding? Why do they become experts in emotional neatness, in making their pain easier to digest, their needs easier to meet, their presence easier to tolerate? Why do they move through love as if they must earn the right to remain by never becoming too heavy in another person's hands? It is rarely because they feel nothing. It is rarely because they naturally need less. And it is almost never because ease is the whole truth of who they are. More often, it is because somewhere along the way, love stopped feeling unconditional and started feeling responsive to performance. Not always in obvious ways, not always through cruelty, sometimes through atmosphere, through patterns, through the repeated emotional weather of a life. A child learns very early what kind of self is easiest for the world to welcome, not through lectures, but through sensation, through the look on someone's face when the child cries too long, through the tension that enters a room when the child asks for something at the wrong moment, through praise that comes when the child is helpful, cheerful, low maintenance, forgiving, through withdrawal when the child is angry, inconvenient, complicated, too needy, too loud, too hurt. And slowly the nervous system begins drawing conclusions. Love stays softer when you are simpler. Affection comes easier when you are useful. Warmth lasts longer when you do not make too much of what hurts. If you want closeness, become easier to carry. So the child adapts. Not because the child is false, because the child is intelligent, because the child is trying to stay attached inside the only emotional climate they know. Music. No one is born believing their full self is too expensive. That belief is taught in fragments. One is sometimes through emotionally unpredictable caregivers, where affection arrives brightly one day and disappears the next. Sometimes through families where conflict is never repaired, only feared. Sometimes through households where there is love, but it is tangled with exhaustion, criticism, or fragility, so the child begins to feel that the adults cannot hold one more feeling, one more need, one more problem. And the child, who should be allowed to be messy, slowly becomes careful instead. They begin reading the room before they read themselves. They begin tracking other people's moods before naming their own. They become unusually skilled at sensing disappointment in silence, irritation in a sigh, emotional danger in the smallest shift of tone. What does that create? Looks a person who knows exactly how to become easy. Easy means not asking at the wrong time. Easy means apologizing before anyone has to tell you that you were too much. Easy means softening a boundary until it sounds like a favor. Easy means translating your hurt into something more elegant, more digestible, less likely to burden the people around you. Easy means learning how to shrink without looking like you are shrinking. And because the world often rewards this adaptation, it becomes harder to question. The easy-to-love person gets praised for being mature, for being understanding, for never causing drama, for not asking for much, for being so self-aware, so kind, so patient. But what if some of that patience is fear? What if some of that self-awareness is hypervigilance? What if some of that kindness is old self-erasure wearing the perfume of virtue? That is the sorrow hidden inside people-pleasing tenderness. The person may appear calm, but inside there may be a constant calculation happening, a quiet arithmetic of how to stay acceptable, how to stay wanted, how to stay close without triggering rejection. Should that need be made smaller? Should that feeling be delayed? Should that truth be softened? Should that boundary be presented as an apology? Should that disappointment be hidden so nobody has to deal with it? And after a while, this calculation becomes so automatic that it no longer feels like fear. It feels like personality. It feels like being thoughtful. It feels like love. But love is not the same thing as constant self-editing. A person who always tries to be easy to love is often not asking one central question, but many small ones hidden inside daily life. Will you still stay if I am tired? Will you still stay if I am upset? Will you still stay if I need reassurance twice instead of once? Will you still stay if I say no? Will you still stay if I am not graceful about my pain? Will you still stay if I am ordinary and inconvenient and human? These questions are rarely spoken aloud. They live lower than language. In the way the body tightens before asking for help, in the way gratitude becomes excessive whenever care is given, in the way sadness gets turned into humor, in the way anger gets diluted into self-blame, in the way the person says it's okay too quickly, even when it is not okay at all. Because being easy to love often means becoming difficult to know. Not because you are dishonest, but because you have learned to show others the version of yourself that feels least likely to be rejected. The polished version, the regulated version, the useful version, the understanding version, the version that can absorb discomfort without returning too much of it. And that version may indeed be lovable, but at what cost? There is a quiet grief in realizing that people may love the self you became to survive more easily than the self you actually are. The deeper self, the one with jaggedness and limits and unfinished feelings, the one that does not always know how to be elegant inside pain, the one that gets confused, irritated, needy, jealous, exhausted, uncertain, the one that wants not only to give softness but to receive it without earning it first. That grief can be hard to name, because on the surface, everything may look fine, relationships may exist, people may call you wonderful, they may describe you as safe, warm, emotionally intelligent, even healing to be around. And yet inside, there may still be loneliness. The loneliness of being valued for how little you require. The loneliness of being praised for how well you disappear at the edges. What a strange thing, to be loved and still feel unseen. This is why some of the people who seem easiest to love often struggle the most to believe they are lovable in their unedited form. They have become so accustomed to managing other people's emotional experience of them that they no longer know where care ends and performance begins. Am I truly kind, or just afraid of being difficult? Am I genuinely low maintenance? Or have I simply learned not to trust that my needs will be handled well? Am I forgiving? Or have I been trained to override hurt too quickly? Am I calm? Or am I just deeply practiced at keeping my storms private? These are not simple questions, because adaptation often buries itself so deeply that it starts looking like identity. The person stops saying, I learned to become easy to keep around, and starts saying, this is just who I am. Just chill, just independent, just not very needy, just good at handling things alone, just understanding. But many identities are protective structures built around old emotional conditions. That does not make them fake. It makes them understandable. And understanding matters because shame tells a very cruel story here. It says that if you are always trying to be easy to love, then you are weak, insecure, desperate, lacking a stronger center. But the deeper truth is far more compassionate. Many people become easy to love because, at some point, being fully human did not feel safe enough. Full humanity meant risk of criticism, risk of withdrawal, risk of burdening someone, risk of hearing the unspoken message that your feelings are too large, your needs too inconvenient, your hurt too untimely, your limits too disruptive. So the psyche chooses a simpler strategy. Become smaller before anyone asks. Become easier before anyone complains. Become useful before anyone can call you expensive. Become gentle enough that no one has to work too hard to keep loving you. But that strategy, though intelligent, has consequences. One of them is resentment, not loud resentment, often not even conscious resentment, but a slow emotional sediment that gathers beneath the surface when a person keeps giving from a self they are never allowed to fully inhabit. They may not express anger directly. That would feel too dangerous, too messy, too unlike the role they have learned to perform. But the body knows. The body always knows when it has been asked to stay lovely while starving. The resentment may show up as fatigue, as emotional numbness, as mysterious withdrawal after closeness, as sudden irritation at small things, as feeling drained by people who seem to need less from you than you need from yourself, as a quiet urge to disappear for a while just to be somewhere no one is asking for your easy version. Because being easy to love often means becoming hard to rest. You are always curating, always anticipating, always adjusting, always making sure the emotional temperature remains manageable, always translating your truth into a softer dialect, and perhaps nobody around you even notices. That is one of the loneliest parts. The person who always tries to be easy to love may look the least distressed, yet often carries an enormous inner workload. They are regulating not only their own feelings, but their presentation of those feelings. They are not merely feeling sadness. They are shaping sadness into something more graceful. Not merely feeling anger, shaping anger into something less threatening. Not merely needing care, shaping need into something small enough that it won't frighten anyone away. This is not only self-control, it is self-containment taken to an art form, and the world tends to romanticize it. But there is nothing romantic about being loved most comfortably when you are half-hidden. There is another layer too. Some people become easy to love because they have confused love with relief. They do not ask, "Who can meet me deeply?" They ask, often unconsciously, "Who seems least irritated by my presence?" That is a different standard entirely, and when that becomes your standard, the heart begins accepting crumbs as safety. A little warmth feels enormous. A little consistency feels sacred. A little patience feels like proof that perhaps you are not too much after all. So you overvalue small mercies. You become deeply grateful for what should have been ordinary tenderness. You thank people for basic decency. You interpret tolerance as devotion. Why? Because if you have spent long enough believing your full self is heavy, then anyone who does not flinch immediately can begin to feel extraordinary. This is how people end up in imbalanced relationships. Not always abusive ones, not always obviously harmful ones. Sometimes just relationships built around a quiet tilt, where one person does more emotional adjusting, more softening, more accommodating, more anticipating. One person becomes the keeper of ease. The other gets to remain more unedited. And over time, the easy-to-love person starts disappearing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the countless tiny edits that accumulate into a false peace. The opinion not voiced, the hurt translated into understanding, the need postponed until it no longer feels urgent, the exhaustion hidden behind a smile, the boundary presented like an apology, the anger turned inward before it can disturb the room. This is what self-erasure often looks like when it is dressed as maturity. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It simply becomes very, very good at being pleasant. But pleasant is not the same thing as alive. A person cannot remain endlessly easy without paying somewhere. The cost may be subtle at first, a sense of emptiness after connection, a faint hollowness after giving comfort, a difficulty identifying what you actually want, because wanting itself has been trained into silence. The feeling that people know you, but somehow only in the forms you have already pre-approved for their comfort. And then perhaps a harder realization comes. If I stopped making myself so easy, would I still be loved? If I were more honest, more direct, more tired, more inconvenient, more visibly hurt, would anyone stay? If I stopped earning affection through restraint, what would remain? That question terrifies many people because it threatens the very strategy that once kept them close to others. If being easy became the bridge to love, then giving it up can feel like stepping off the only structure that has ever held. But there is a hidden tragedy there too. Some people do not know whether they are loved because they are lovable or because they are so careful not to trouble anyone with the fuller truth of themselves. What a heavy uncertainty to carry. And still, none of this means tenderness itself is false. Not at all. People who try to be easy to love are often genuinely thoughtful, deeply empathetic, highly attuned. They really do care about other people's feelings. They really do want harmony. They really do value gentleness. These are beautiful qualities. The problem begins when gentleness is no longer free, when kindness is fused with fear, when empathy becomes over-responsibility, when patience becomes self-abandonment, when warmth becomes a way of securing belonging rather than simply expressing the truth of who you are. That distinction matters. A person can be deeply kind without treating their needs like an inconvenience. A person can be patient without disappearing. A person can be understanding without making endless room for everyone but themselves. A person can be loving without becoming easy to consume. But if you have spent years learning otherwise, that difference can feel almost impossible to trust. Because being less edited may feel dangerous, less graceful, less safe, perhaps even selfish. That is how deep the conditioning goes. The person may feel guilty the moment they become harder to carry. Guilty for needing more reassurance. Guilty for taking longer to recover. Guilty for not being in the mood to soothe everyone else. Guilty for asking for reciprocity instead of offering endless understanding. Guilty for having a sharp edge after years of serving softness. And guilt here is not always a moral signal. Often it is just the feeling of stepping outside an old role, the role of the easy one, the good one, the one who never asks for too much, the one who can be loved with very little effort. What lies beneath that role is often a very old longing, the longing to be loved without becoming smaller first. Not loved because you are undemanding. Not loved because you are calm enough, useful enough, self-aware enough, forgiving enough, low maintenance enough. I just loved. Loved while complicated. Loved while uncertain. Loved while still learning. Loved while inconvenient for a moment. Loved while hurt. Loved while honest. Loved while fully human. For many people, that kind of love feels almost mythical. Not because it does not exist, but because their nervous system learned to expect connection to become fragile the moment they stopped being easy. This is why some people feel most anxious not when they are alone, but when they are being cared for. Because real care stirs a dangerous hope. A hope that perhaps this time they will not have to perform lightness to remain wanted. And hope for someone shaped by conditional love can feel terrifying. It asks the heart to risk disappointment again. So even in good relationships, the pattern may continue. They still overthink, still underask, still downplay, still say it's fine too fast, still become the understanding one by reflex, still try to solve their own pain before showing it, as if raw emotion must first be cleaned before it can be offered to another person. That is how survival habits continue into safer places. Not because the person wants distance, but because the body is still loyal to old rules. And those rules once made sense. That must be remembered. A child who became easy to love was not failing. That child was adapting brilliantly to an environment where ease felt safer than authenticity, where minimizing need reduced tension, where emotional neatness preserved attachment, where softness had survival value. That adaptation deserves compassion, not contempt. not mockery, not the shallow accusation that the person is simply insecure or trying too hard. It is deeper than that. It is history carried in posture. It is biography carried in tone. It is longing folded into politeness. It is fear disguised as grace. And perhaps that is why people who always try to be easy to love often feel so tired in ways they cannot explain. Because it is exhausting to keep translating your full humanity into something more manageable. It is exhausting to be tender on command, to be low maintenance when you are not, to be emotionally elegant while silently aching to be met without all the editing. A person can live like this for years and still not know why love feels both comforting and lonely. Comforting because it offers connection. Lonely because it often reaches the role before it reaches the self. And that is the wound, perhaps. Not that you are too kind. Not that you are too patient. Not that you care too much about other people. The wound is that somewhere along the way, love became tied to how little of yourself other people had to carry. The wound is that your fullness began to feel negotiable. The wound is that being lovable started to look like being effortless. The wound is that your needs were not always welcomed as part of your humanity, but experienced as pressure on the bond itself. What happens to a person after long enough inside that belief? They become remarkable at tenderness toward others and uncertain about tenderness toward themselves. They learn how to make room, but not how to believe their own roominess deserves equal honoring. They become fluent in patience, but not in permission. They learn how to absorb, accommodate, soothe, and soften. Yet they may never have learned the deeper emotional truth that love worthy of the name can withstand the weight of a whole person. Not a polished person, a whole one. And whole people are not always easy. They are grieving sometimes. They are contradictory sometimes. They are slow sometimes. They are sharp sometimes. They are needy sometimes. They miscommunicate. They need repair. They take time. They feel too much on certain days. They do not always arrive with their pain translated into something pretty. That is not failure. That is being real. And perhaps this is the quiet revelation at the center of the pattern. The need to be easy to love is often born from the fear that your natural weight will drive people away, but a life built entirely around weightlessness eventually becomes unbearable in its own way, because human beings are not meant to float through intimacy without gravity. They are meant to land, to be felt, to be known in more than their edited forms. Music. So when you notice someone who is always so understanding, so careful, so undemanding, so beautifully easy to love, there may be more happening than kindness alone. There may be an old adaptation there, an old emotional contract, a quiet belief that love lasts longest when you do not make too much of yourself. And if you recognize yourself in that pattern, then perhaps there is something worth holding gently. The wound is not that you are too much. The wound is that you learn to survive by becoming less. The wound is not your softness. The wound is that softness had to become strategy. The wound is not that you want to be loved. It is that some part of you still believes love must be made easy for other people at the expense of your own wholeness. If this reflection found something true in you, let it stay there for a while. Let it sit beside the part of you that became graceful so early, the part that learned to turn need into politeness and pain into quietness. There is nothing shameful about how carefully you learn to remain lovable. And if you want more reflections like this, more language for the hidden patterns that shape the way a person gives, hides, softens, and longs, stay close. Sometimes the first step is not becoming easier. It is finally being understood in the places where you have spent so long trying not to be too much.